It's just after 6 in the morning on the last day of July 2022. The sun is barely up over Strongsville, Ohio, a quiet suburb about 20 minutes outside Cleveland. The kind of place where, at this hour, the loudest thing on the road is usually a delivery truck. A man riding his motorcycle down a dead-end business park spots something at the very end of the street. A car. Except it doesn't look like a car anymore. He calls 911. He tells the dispatcher a vehicle has jumped the curb, taken out a sign, and slammed into the side of a building. He says the car is trashed, he won't even walk up to it. When the first officer arrives, he starts running. You can hear him on the body camera, out of breath, calling it in piece by piece. One occupant inside. Then at least two. Then 3. 3 young people in a single car, and not one of them is moving. The front passenger side of that car looks like it went through a hydraulic press. The whole front end is shredded down to bare metal. 2 of the 3 people inside are pronounced dead right there at the scene. They're both barely out of their teens. The third person, the driver, is still alive. Badly hurt, but alive. A medical helicopter lands on the road to fly her to the hospital. She is 17 years old. Her name is Mackenzie Shirilla. And when detectives knock on her hospital door the next day to ask the only question that matters, what happened in that car, she tells them she can't remember a single thing. For a while, everyone believes this is a tragedy, a horrible, senseless accident. But over the next year, investigators are going to pull data out of that wrecked car, footage off nearby cameras, and tens of thousands of messages off her phone. And the story that comes back is not the story of an accident. This is the case of Mackenzie Shirilla and how a crash that looked like the worst day of a teenager's life slowly turned into a murder trial. To understand this case, you have to understand the 3 people inside that Toyota. In the front passenger seat was Dominic Russo. Dom was 20 years old. He'd grown up in Strongsville, close to his family, a brother, a sister, parents he saw constantly. He'd actually moved into his own place, but it was right next door to his mum, so he was over for dinner all the time. People who knew him describe him as easygoing and calm. In the back seat was Devion Flanagan. Devion was 19. He was the oldest of 3 kids, adopted along with his 2 younger sisters. At Strongsville High, he'd been the starting running back on the football team, and in the off-season he coached youth swimming. After graduating, he'd been working full-time and had plans to start Barber College that fall. By every description, he was a good kid with a future lined up. And here's the detail that makes Davion's death so hard to sit with. He wasn't really part of this. He and Dom had only gotten close recently, connecting over music. Davion's family had gone on vacation. He'd just started a new job and couldn't take the time off, so he crashed at Dom's place for a couple of weeks. That's the only reason he was even there that night. The prosecutor would later put it bluntly in the driver's mind. Davion was, in his words, basically just cargo in the back seat. And in the driver's seat, Mackenzie Shirilla. 17 years old, just days away from her 18th birthday. And depending on who you ask, you get 2 completely different versions of who she was. Some friends describe someone who stood up for people, who'd check on you when you were upset. Other people describe something very different, someone with a temper. A long list of people she had problems with, and a habit of saying genuinely cruel things to anyone she decided she didn't like. What's not really in dispute is that Mackenzie wanted to be famous. She wanted to be an influencer. She posted constantly fashion, her car, her lifestyle. And she also posted over and over videos of herself driving, filming herself behind the wheel, lip-syncing, showing off, sometimes barely looking at the road. Hold on to that, because the way she drove is going to matter a lot. Mackenzie and Dom had been together for about 4 years, and the timeline there raises eyebrows on its own. The relationship reportedly started when she was around 13 and he was 16. By 2021, they were living together. Mackenzie was still in high school, still a minor, and she had essentially moved into Dom's house. Her parents knew. They could see what was being posted online, and, according to later reporting, they were largely fine with it. Now, the prosecution's whole theory of this case rests on one idea, that this relationship was toxic, and that it was getting worse. So let's look at what came out publicly to support that, because a lot of it did come out. After the crash, police pulled nearly 93,000 text messages between Mackenzie and Dom. That's not a typo, tens of thousands of messages spanning years. And when reporters and investigators went through them, a pattern showed up again and again. The pattern looks like this. Mackenzie would get upset often over something small. She'd escalate fast. She'd give Dom countdowns and ultimatums, apologize by a specific time, make it up to me, or we're done. She'd threaten to block him, to move on, to start talking to other people. And Dom, at least in the messages that surfaced, would usually be the one trying to calm things down, trying to de-escalate. And eventually, just giving in. I want to be careful and fair here, because this is contested. Mackenzie's family disputes the idea that she was abusive. They point out that text messages can be cherry-picked, that you can build any narrative you want out of 90,000 messages by choosing which ones to show. That's a legitimate point, and the documentary filmmakers themselves said they deliberately looked at both the positive and negative exchanges to stay neutral. So keep that in mind. What the prosecution presented was a selection. But here is the part that became central to the case, because it wasn't just texts. It was a witness. About 2 weeks before the crash, Dom and Mackenzie got into it while she was driving, with Dom in the passenger seat. According to a prosecutor's filing, Dom called his mother and asked to be picked up. A family friend went to get him, and that friend told police that while he was on the phone with Dom, he heard Mackenzie in the background and that she said she would crash the car. Right then. 2 weeks before she actually did. Now again, in fairness, Mackenzie's parents have publicly disputed that account. They say that piece of evidence is false, and that she never threatened anyone's physical life. The defense's position is that this is exactly the kind of after-the-fact statement that gets read as sinister only because of how the story ended. But you can see why, once investigators heard it, they started looking at this crash very differently. The night before the crash, the three of them were together. Late on July 30th, they stopped by a graduation party at a friend's house. Around 11, they went to another friend's place, where they hung out, listened to music, and smoked. They stayed there into the early morning, and they left at about 5:30 in the morning on July 31st, heading back toward Dom's house. And this is where one of the eeriest details of the entire case comes in. Davian was connected to his friends through a location-sharing app, the kind parents use to track teens, and friends use to keep tabs on each other. His parents had recently taken him off their family tracking, so he'd linked it to his friend group instead. Totally normal, responsible thing. Which means that morning, Davian's friends could see where he was. And later, when they checked the history, the app had quietly logged the whole thing. It recorded the car moving in the early morning. It recorded a high-speed alert. According to the data described in court, the vehicle hit speeds around 90 miles per hour. And then, at 5:36 a.m., the movement just stops. That's the crash. The road they ended up on is called Progress Drive, an industrial business park. And it's important to picture it, because it's not a highway. It's an older, beat-up commercial road lined with warehouses, pipeline companies, metal shops, that kind of thing. No houses, no shops, no pedestrians. At 5:30 in the morning, nobody around, and the pavement is rough, bumpy enough that one officer would later say his cruiser's wheel was shaking when he tried to drive it fast down that same stretch. You follow Progress Drive to the very end, and the road forces you to turn left or right. You can't go straight, because straight ahead is grass, a company sign, and a solid, red brick building. The car went straight. It blew through the sign, across the grass, and drove directly into the corner of that warehouse at close to 100 miles per hour. No turn. No swerve. Straight in. And then it sat there, in a dead-end business park where nobody would pass by, for somewhere around 45 minutes, until a man on a motorcycle happened to ride down that road and call it in. Here's the thing. When police first got to that scene, they were not thinking murder. Nobody was. They had 3 young people who'd been out late. They found drugs in the car. Investigators recovered around 8 grams of mushrooms, a bag of marijuana, and a digital scale. So the first, obvious theory was impaired driving, a tragic, drug-related accident. It was initially handled as an accident. But then, the toxicology came back. And it didn't fit. Mackenzie did have marijuana in her system, but not at a level investigators believed would have impaired her enough to cause this. And there was no alcohol. And the mushrooms weren't found to be active in her system at the time. So the she was too high to drive theory started falling apart. Then, they pulled the cameras. A nearby building had security footage. And there was more footage from the main road she'd turned off of. When investigators watched it, they saw something that didn't make sense for an impaired driver at all. On the main road, Mackenzie drives normally. She signals. She slows down. She makes a clean, controlled right turn onto Progress Drive. A completely competent driver. And then, within about half a mile, that same driver goes from totally in control to flooring it into a building at nearly 100 miles an hour. That's the contradiction that flipped this case. Because their thinking became, if she were genuinely blacked out or impaired, she couldn't have navigated that bumpy industrial road at that speed and threaded it dead center into the corner of the building. A truly incapacitated driver hits something first, a curb, a sign, drifts off. This wasn't drifting. This was a straight line. So investigators went to the one witness that can't lie, exaggerate, or forget, the car's black box. The event data recorder. And what it recorded became the heart of the prosecution's case. In roughly the final 5 seconds before impact, the accelerator was pressed all the way down 100%. Floored, as far as it can physically go. And in those same final seconds, the brake was never touched. Not once. There was also a hard yank of the steering wheel, a sharp turn of about 142 degrees right at the end. And the gear shifter was moved between drive and neutral and back in those last few seconds. That's not something that happens on its own. Someone moved it by hand. And then there was the GP's. Mackenzie's own phone data placed her in that same obscure industrial area a few days before the crash on a route the court noted she didn't normally take. The prosecution argued that was scouting, planning, premeditation. Now, the defense had answers for some of this. And we'll get to those, because this case is genuinely argued on both sides. But 2 more physical details stuck with investigators. First, the slipper. Early on, there was a theory that one of Mackenzie's fuzzy slippers had gotten jammed under the gas pedal, forcing it down, which would point to an accident. But the forensic analysis concluded the opposite. The slipper got wedged there because of the impact. When the floor of the car crumpled around it, it didn't cause the crash caused it. And second, the seatbelts. The 2 boys were found without their seatbelts on. People who knew them said they always wore them. The theory investigators and the prosecution leaned toward is chilling, that in those final seconds, Dom and Davian had unbuckled and were desperately trying to save themselves, grabbing the wheel, yanking the gear shift, trying to stop a car that was being driven straight into a wall. And Mackenzie, who, in all those videos of herself driving, almost never wore a seatbelt that morning, she had hers on. She was the only one of the 3 wearing it. So if it wasn't drugs, and it wasn't a stuck slipper, the defense needed an explanation for the one fact that's almost impossible to explain. Why would a car accelerate to 100 miles an hour, with no braking, straight into a building? Their answer was a medical condition called POTS. POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, affects how your body regulates heart rate and blood flow, especially when you stand up. The defense's argument was that Mackenzie had been diagnosed with POTS, that it could cause her to lose consciousness, and that she may have had a medical episode blacked out right before the crash. That would mean no intent. A medical tragedy, not a murder. And it's worth taking seriously. Because this is the exact issue her lawyers are still fighting on appeal today. But there were real holes in it, and the prosecution drove right through them. For one, fainting is actually not a defining feature of POTS. A lot of people with the condition never faint at all. So the public image of it as a fainting disease is, frankly, a bit of a misconception. And people who actually live with POTS have pushed back hard on the way this case portrayed it. For another, the paperwork didn't match the defense's story. Mackenzie's mother acknowledged that she'd helped Mackenzie apply for a driver's license twice after the POTS diagnosis, and that the condition was never disclosed either time. And when Mackenzie applied for a temporary license after the crash, she attested that she did not have any condition that causes episodes of lost consciousness or muscle control. You can't really build a defense around a blackout condition you formally swore you didn't have. And then maybe the biggest problem of all, the defense, at the original trial, never actually called a medical expert to explain how POTS could have caused this crash. The condition was barely mentioned. No specialist got up and connected the dots for the judge. Which is wild, when it was supposedly the entire explanation. In fairness, and this is the strongest part of Mackenzie's current appeal, her new lawyers argue that's exactly the failure. They say her original trial attorneys dropped the ball, that they should have investigated the POTS angle properly and brought in expert testimony, and that if they had, she might have been acquitted. There's even reporting on text messages where Mackenzie complained about blackouts in the past, including one just weeks before the crash. So the defense says there was something there, and her own lawyers failed to use it. The prosecution's response is just as direct. There was no medical evidence that she actually blacked out before impact. And a blackout, they argued, doesn't press the gas pedal all the way to the floor and steer a perfect line into a building. Mackenzie was arrested about 3 months after the crash, in November of 2022. By the time of trial, she was 19. And here's a decision that people still debate. Her defense waived a jury. She chose a bench trial, meaning one person, the judge, would decide everything. No 12 jurors. Just Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Judge Nancy Margaret Russo. Over the course of the trial in August 2023, prosecutors laid it all out. The crash reconstruction, the surveillance video, the black box data, the GPs placing her on that route days earlier, the relationship evidence, and testimony from investigators and from the victims' families. The defense argued accident and raised the POTS condition, but without the expert backbone to carry it. And when the judge delivered her verdict, she did not hold back. She walked through the surveillance footage and described how Mackenzie went from a responsible driver to, in her words, literal hell on wheels as she came down that street. She said Mackenzie alone chose the car, chose the route, chose the time of day. She said Mackenzie had a mission and executed it with precision. And she rejected the idea that this was reckless driving. Her line became the headline that followed this case everywhere. This was not reckless driving, this was murder. The verdict: guilty. On all 12 felony counts. Multiple counts of murder, felonious assault, aggravated vehicular homicide, plus drug and related charges. 1 week later, she was sentenced to 2 concurrent terms of 15 years to life in prison. First eligibility for parole, the year 2037. At sentencing, Mackenzie spoke. She cried. She apologized to both families. She called Dom her soulmate. And she said what she has said from the very beginning, and still says today, that she would never have let this happen on purpose, and that she wishes she could remember what happened. This case did not end at sentencing. In a lot of ways, it's more alive right now than it was the day of the verdict. Mackenzie's family has never accepted the conviction. Her father has publicly said they believe she's innocent, that the evidence doesn't show intent, and that at most this should have been a vehicular homicide charge, not murder. Her mother says Mackenzie never got a fair trial, and that her first lawyer didn't use everything the family handed over, and they've kept fighting. The appeals, so far, haven't gone their way. The conviction was upheld by the Ohio Court of Appeals. And then came one of the strangest twists in the whole story, a legal challenge that may have been lost over a single day. Her attorneys reportedly missed a filing deadline by one day, and part of the argument is that they failed to account for 2024 being a leap year. Her newest lawyers have asked the Ohio Supreme Court to step in, arguing the clock should have started later and that she deserves another look. As of now, the court hasn't said whether it will take the case. The prosecutor's office says it remains fully confident in the conviction. And then, nearly 4 years after the crash, the whole country found this case at once because Netflix released a documentary about it called The Crash. It shot to #1. And for the first time, a lot of people heard directly from Mackenzie herself, speaking from prison. She repeated her account, no memory of that morning, and that nothing about it was intentional, because in her words, that's not who she is. After the documentary dropped, Strongsville police released a massive batch of records hours of video, jail calls, and those tens of thousands of text messages, and the internet has been picking through all of it ever since, re-litigating the case in public. But underneath all the streaming numbers and the appeals and the online debate, there are two families who lost their kids. Dominic Russo. Davion Flanagan. Davion, the kid who was only in that car because his family went on vacation, and he didn't want to be home alone. The families have spoken about the holes left behind, and they've backed an effort sometimes referred to as Dom's Law, aimed at keeping convicted violent offenders from profiting off their crimes. So I'll leave the real question with you, because it's the same question that's now sitting in front of the Ohio Supreme Court. A 17-year-old girl. A car that went from a calm, signaled turn to 100 miles an hour in half a mile. A flawed gas pedal, a brake that was never touched, and two boys in the car who, in their final seconds, may have been fighting to take the wheel. Was this a teenager who suffered a medical blackout at the worst possible moment? Or was it exactly what the judge called it, a mission, executed with precision? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want me to break down the full text message evidence in a part 2, say so down below, and I'll see you in the next one.